So one thing that really struck me about The Secret of the Mimic trailer was this poster found in the security office. Don't be late. Late employees are subject to fines and/or punishment. What's striking is the imagery. A large pointed finger aimed aggressively at a child. This would be incredibly weird for a company to have in their factory, so why is it there? Well, it's trying to tell us what the story of FNAF is partially about. Bad parenting. The Fazbear Frights stories have multiple examples of how bad parenting affects children. In Count the Ways, Millie's eccentric, emotionally neglectful parents leave her out in the cold, unable to accept the love and warmth of her grandfather, driving her straight into the death trap that is Funtime Freddy. In 1:35 a.m, Delilah is repeatedly awoken by traumatic memories of her foster father sneaking into her room at night to abuse her, leading her to continue searching for a safe place until it literally kills her. And in What We Found, the trauma from Hudson's abusive stepfather leads Hudson to seek healing and safety so intensely, he accidentally causes not only his mother and stepfather's deaths, but his own. When children are not properly cared for, their lives are in serious danger. Other stories, however, make it clear that children can be saved by good parenting. For example, Dance With Me tells of Casey and how she was neglected by her party-addicted mother and eventually kicked out of home by her cruel stepfather. Casey survives as a homeless teenager until a stranger, herself a mother, shows Casey warmth and forgiveness. The mother's own daughter dancing at the end with Ballora is a celebration of Casey's inner child being healed and feeling loved. By properly caring for children, they can live long and happy lives, achieving their goals and reaching their potential. Specifically though, this post is trying to draw attention to the parenting styles of William and Henry. We know that William is a bad parent. Midnight Motorist shows him shouting and banging aggressively on the crying child's door, while Mike begs him to stop. In the novels, we see him repeatedly deny Elizabeth the attention every child needs from their parents, and go so far as to actively hit her. This makes her obsessed with the one thing her father did care about, Circus Baby, and we know how well that ended. Finally, the movie shows how Vanessa is torn between loyalty to her abusive father and a desperation to be free from him. And we see how William attempts repeatedly to exert power over the spirits in the suits, convincing them about how small they are, how naughty they are, how fundamentally wrong they are. Given all of this, it's easy to see how William is a terrible parent. But what about Henry? On the surface, Henry was a loving father. Charlie spent significant time with him while he worked on the animatronics in his workshop. She played at her father's restaurant, often being around him while he interacted with customers. Henry made Stanley, Theodore, and Ella so that Charlie's room would be filled with unique and exciting toys. He made Charlie so that he didn't have to face the reality of losing her. How could he not be considered a good father? Except, even from the beginning of the Silver Eyes, we're clued into the fact that Henry wasn't able to give Charlie everything that she actually needed. Upon returning to her father's house at the beginning of Silver Eyes, Charlie realizes she had not really noticed it as a child, but the house was built a little too large for the furniture they had. Things were spread out too widely in order to fill the space, the easy chair too far across the room to carry on a conversation. Charlie had never felt a lack of anything as a child, but it seemed now that the unnecessary enormity of the house was a sort of apology, the attempt of a man who had lost so much to give his daughter what he could. Charlie's life was filled with gaps that were imperceptible when she was a child, but became painfully clear as she grew older. I imagine the easy chair was Henry's, even though it's not specified in the story. You can imagine the stereotype of a father having staked his claim to a particular chair, sitting in front of the TV, not physically distant, but emotionally too far away for conversation, for connection. The gaps in Charlie's life were a form of emotional neglect. While he could give her everything else, Henry was too suffocated by the grief of losing his human daughter that he was unable to give her robot recreation the love she deserved. But he was even like this before Charlie's death. When Charlie finds a family photo album, she remarks on a photo of her parents. Her mother was beaming happily at the camera, her face alight and flushed, but her father was staring into the distance, a smile fixed on his face like he had left it there by mistake. His dark eyes were intense, remote, and Charlie resisted the sudden urge to look behind her, as if she might see whatever he was looking at. Shortly after, she explains to John, "I remember him dressing up for us in the yellow Freddy suit, doing the dances, miming along with the songs. It was so much a part of him. He was the restaurant, there was no one else. And he was always so distant, like in that picture. There was always something else going on beneath the surface. It was like he had a real life and a secret life. We were the secret life. His real life was his work. It was what mattered. And when he was with us, there was always a part of him that was back in reality, whatever that was for him. Henry was a workaholic, so obsessed with his restaurant that he unintentionally neglected his family. It's possible this is why Charlie's death hit him so hard. If you take the natural grief of having lost a child, and add to it the guilt of having not spent enough time with her, or been there to protect her when you feel you should have, it's a devastating combination. It could easily explain why he felt driven to recreate her as a robot, not just because he missed her, but to assuage his own guilt and make up for his past mistakes. Unfortunately, the grief got in the way. His rage made things worse by infecting the fourth Charlie bot, and in the end the only option he felt he had left was suicide. This lines up well with Edwin's story. Struggling to manage the responsibilities of parenting and the unreasonable workload provided by Fazbear Entertainment, Edwin builds Mimic, passing off the responsibility for raising his child to AI so that he can focus on his career. He could have built a robot to do his work for him, but he chose to forego parenting instead. Work was more important. As the story progresses, Edwin increasingly treats David like an inconvenience. On page 152, Edwin, quote, throws himself into his work, stopping only to feed David or answer David's occasional questions. His passive neglect of David's emotional needs is severely showing. One morning, David gets toothpaste on a clean shirt. Edwin yells at David in frustration not to be careless, and David comes close to crying. Edwin shouts, "Don't you dare start crying," causing David to cry and turn away from his dad to protect himself. Edwin grabs and shakes David, still shouting at him. Edwin justifies this by thinking that he has so much work to do, and he just wants David to brush his teeth and go and sit and play with Mimic. Was that too much to ask? Edwin promises David he'll do better next time, but he didn't. His resolve fled him a mere 10 minutes after the incident. David and Mimic end up playing with some of Fazbear Entertainment's costumes. Edwin cracks it at both of them for getting the costumes dirty. Edwin roughly drags David out of the costume, causing David to cry and scream. David is told to go play quietly again, and he does so, but later comes back saying, "Daddy, I'm hungry." Edwin, in the middle of a tricky soldering job, ignores him. David prods Edwin's elbow, causing him to make a mistake. Edwin shouts at David once again. Edwin then looks up to the roof above him. He watched a spider toiling in the middle of its web, which was monstrous, over 3 feet wide. Edwin noted that the spider was alone. Unhampered by spiderlings, the huge black insect was managing far more productivity than Edwin was. Edwin pulled his gaze from the spider and rolled his shoulders. He ruffled David's hair. "It's okay, David, but could you please play quietly for a little bit longer while I finish what I'm doing here?" "Okay, Daddy," David said. Edwin has made his choice. He feels burdened by the care David requires, and sees more potential in himself and his work in the alternate reality where David does not exist. He chooses to prioritize a soldering job over feeding his hungry son. In this moment, Edwin has sealed David's fate. The consequences of Edwin's neglect can only be David's death. This reminds me of Elizabeth's memory of the time she attempted to approach William while he worked at his desk on Circus Baby. She was so eager to share her accomplishment with her father, but he ignored her, literally pushing her away. Eventually, when she persisted, he hit her and went back to his work, stepping on her certificate for good measure. And of course, we know Elizabeth ends up killed by and possessing Circus Baby. Much like David, the only result of William's abuse and prioritization of work can be Elizabeth's death. But the question is why? If Edwin is supposed to be Henry, then why does his behaviour steer so far towards William's side of things? Well, one common way to tell a story is to frame your protagonist and antagonist as two sides of the same coin. Think of Percy and Luke from Percy Jackson. Both suffered through absentee parents, ostracization from society, and physical danger from a very early age. Percy actively sought systemic change, convincing the Olympian gods to claim and respect their own children, as well as the minor gods. Luke's bitterness and resentment for his father, however, and his inability to see a constructive way forward, made him an easy target for manipulation by Cronus, who sought to destroy the gods completely. These choices are what separate them into protagonist and antagonist, not the life they started out with. These are the roles Henry and William fill. Both are crappy fathers, but due to different reasons. Henry, like Edwin, is a workaholic. His sense of self is defined by his productivity, and while it's very clear he loves his family, he cannot keep his mind off of his addiction to work. When he's given the consequences of these actions, like Edwin, he takes them on board. He cradles Charlie's rag doll and grieves deeply for her in the same way we see Edwin do with David's toy tiger. He is disturbed by his robotic recreation of the child he lost, just like Edwin is disturbed by the mimic's recreation of David's behaviour. And he chooses to abandon his current life, recognising it as presently unsalvageable just like Edwin does, although Henry in the novels chooses a much more permanent solution to his problem than simply running away. The reason for this difference is the novels are a closed story. Each storyline needs to be tied up neatly. The games are ongoing, thus there's more room to explore Henry's storyline and give him a chance at redemption years down the line. The Henry we hear about in Pizzeria Simulator's Insanity ending is very clearly aware and shows genuine remorse for the damage he has caused, and he has resolved to fix it. This would be the equivalent of Edwin resurfacing on the board of Fazbear Entertainment 40 years after he goes missing. Conversely, William doesn't get a redemption arc. As the Silver Eyes makes very clear, William blames the world for his lot in life. He allows bitterness and resentment to consume him, and believes he has a right to enact what he sees as righteous violence on an unjust world. Even after his actions get him impaled by spring locks, he continues to push the boundaries, to experiment on himself, to harvest remnant, and to treat others, especially Elizabeth, like inconveniences at best. In the movie, right up until the very last moment before the spring locks go off, William attempts to assert his power over a bunch of angry, grieving children by demeaning and dehumanizing them.
Look at you. Look at the nasty things that you have become. Look how small you are, how worthless you are. You are wretched, rotten little beast. I made you.
And only shortly before that, he stabbed his own daughter in an attempt to kill her. William does not, perhaps even cannot, learn from his mistakes. This is what keeps him in the position of the bad guy. I normally don't enjoy the idea that William and Henry have such similar storylines. It feels confusing and honestly quite repetitive. But framing it this way not only makes more sense of the story, but kind of shows how it couldn't really be any other way. William and Henry have to be reflections of each other, living the same lives but going to very different places. Through this, FNAF as a horror story, often moral tales, comes to tell a cautionary tale of being wary of our priorities, of the importance of connection and attentive relationships, of recognizing and atoning for our mistakes, and of not allowing negative feelings like rage, resentment, and self-pity to control our actions. And to push this further, the concept of two sides of the same coin is littered throughout the series. Charlie and Elizabeth are the same neglected daughter, but with two very different results. Moon and Sun represent unbridled rage and the neurotic desperation to keep it under wraps, respectively. Vanny represents William's complete control over someone, while Vanessa, in both the games and the movies, represents the self that eventually got free. And Tiger Rock's one green, one blue eye serves as evidence of his dual personality, either being possessed by two different complementary entities, or as his mimicking of two different but complementary sources. And what does this mean for the lore? Well, it gives us more understanding of Henry, William, and Edwin, and it might allow us to better piece together the earlier events in a way that makes more narrative sense. I think it also gives a sense of where the stories and the character development of these men are headed, and that can be useful to structure the timeline around. It hopefully also makes some of our clues clearer, as it can be difficult to figure out what clues mean between the books, games, and movies all seemingly contradicting each other. But that's outside the scope of this video. As always, I'd love to hear what you think in the comments. Are you as excited for Secret of the Mimic as I am? Are you also so desperate for any new content in the series that you overthink about a single poster on the wall in a 40-second trailer for a game that's still 4 months away? Let me know. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.